From sending helmets to supplying lethal weapons, Berlin reverses its peace policy and sends tanks to Ukraine. Is Chancellor Olaf Scholz ushering in a new era in Germany? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Olaf Scholz was once described as the embodiment of boredom in politics. And in his first few months in office, that label seemed to fit well enough. But then Russia attacked Ukraine, and soon the chancellor was transforming years of foreign, fiscal, and military policy. In a historic speech to the German parliament, Scholz declared the world had entered a new era.
We are experiencing a turning point. And this means that the world after this is no longer the same as the world before it. In essence, it's a question of whether power can break right, whether we allow Putin to turn back the clocks to the time of the great powers of the 19th century, or whether we have the strength to set limits to warmongers like Vladimir Putin.
Well, Berlin has for decades implemented a strict policy of not sending weapons to war zones, even preventing Estonia from providing German-made weapons to Ukraine in January. But a month later, that position changed. In an instant, the German Chancellor reversed tact and agreed to supply Kiev with lethal weapons and tanks.
We have met a far-reaching decision which is linked to the turning point of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Germany will deliver weapons to this war zone. This was a path that Germany has not taken for years, which was supported from all political parties. After we have changed this, lots of other European countries have also decided to change their weapons delivery.
Well, Russia's attack on Ukraine has put Germany in an awkward position. Berlin's relationship with Moscow may not always run smoothly, but they've been strong trading partners. Both nations were set to benefit massively from a multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline called Nord Stream 2. It would have brought Russian gas directly to Germany. Before Russia's attack, Berlin was pretty unwilling to cancel the controversial pipeline, calling it a primarily commercial venture. But as soon as the Kremlin's forces crossed into Ukraine, Scholz halted the project, and last month he vowed to cut his country's reliance on Russian gas.
We are actively working to get independent from the import of oil, and we think that we will be able to make it during this year. And we are actively working to get independent from the necessity of importing gas from Russia.
So from a pacifist approach, somewhat sympathetic to Russia, to an entirely new policy in line firmly with its NATO allies. Has Russia's invasion of Ukraine brought about a new Germany? Joining me now to debate that and more is Ulrich Brueckner, a professor of European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. Bodo Weber also joins us from the German capital. He's a senior associate at the Democratization Policy Council. And from Ankara is political analyst Klaus Jürgens. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, back in January, we spoke at length on this program about Germany going its own way. You know, regardless of criticism, Berlin was determining its own policy toward Russia, even if it ran contrary to wider NATO consensus. And so here we are just a few months later, witnessing a 180-degree shift. Bodo Weber, were you surprised?
Well, I guess, first of all, to a certain degree, everybody was surprised about this kind of Putin's invasion into Ukraine, though we saw it coming, but nobody really expected it. I guess that's part of why Germany had not changed course ahead of the invasion. And then when this time shift came, Germany was simply forced to adjust to this reality that they never had planned nor wanted to see. So in a way, yes, surprise, but I would say that this was in the end inevitable.
Right. So the invasion was more of a surprise than the change in actual policy, in your opinion. Let me turn to Ulrich, though, because you had specifically criticized Olaf Scholz's communication skills a few months back. Have you changed your mind at all? Because some are saying, after what he called the Zeitenwende, or turning point when Russia invaded Ukraine, that he kind of became a different Olaf Scholz. Have circumstances changed him?
Well, I cannot read his mind, and so I don't know if there is a certain consistency in his position, which he tries to communicate now, frantically giving interviews and appearing on all forms of media to try to explain himself, something he did very wrong in the last few weeks, which caused not only raising eyebrows, but it also caused a different perspective, especially in our Central and Eastern European neighbors in the European Union that fear that Germany is not as reliable as they wish it is. So there's one thing, the bad communication strategy, but there's also a different world in which Germany appears as an actor. And as the previous speaker just said, in a changing world, it's inevitable to change positions. And what finally ended was wishful thinking. It's not so much that everything changed, because Germany is still very committed to be a European Union member and a NATO member and belongs to the Western world.
Okay, it's not only really remarkable, though, Ulrich, I'm going to stick with you, in that, military and even energy policy are being changed on this scale, but that there's full consensus around it. All parties are on board. I mean, even the Greens have agreed to postpone phasing out nuclear power in order to cut the need for Russian gas imports. Tell me, from the German perspective, are Germans feeling good about this?
Well, in a pluralist society, you will always find someone who is not happy with what the government is doing. And so what we recently saw is open letters expressing very different perspectives on, we should rather have done this, or have you really thought about this unintended consequence, or what if that leads to an escalation. And I think this is perfectly fine and a sign of a functioning democracy. If the government at the end of the day stands firm and follows a certain path that is also well communicated, then there's nothing wrong with a cacophonic orchestra in a diverse society that doesn't share everything the government says.
Okay, but let me ask Bodo quickly, also as a German yourself in Berlin, has, seeing everyone on board politically in this case, has it given Germans more of a kind of sense of unity or common purpose right now in their stance on Ukraine?
Well, I would say that Mr. Putin's unbelievable, really extraordinary actions have forced unity. There's almost no choice of not having unity, but what we can see here is, and that's something I consider very similar to this kind of very contentious debate we had in the German political and broader public during the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, is an unease with this 21st Germany in the 21st century, and the Germany that has not come to any collective self-understanding of its role in the post-Cold War world, because Germany had been in this very comfortable position in the post-Second World War area of sitting on a security and foreign policy island, basically secured by the US. And this kind of fetishized pacifism that we have nurtured for these decades is part of that heritage. And falling out of this context in '89, with the Balkan Wars first, of Germany becoming a bigger global actor by unification, by default, is something that has not yet led to some kind of, even after the Balkan Wars, when we made practical adjustments being forced by the situation, like in the current crisis, what we're still missing is a kind of a debate on a collective understanding, self-understanding of Germany in this global world order. And that's exactly what we see currently. We see the practical adjustment, a forced adjustment, a unity, but at the same time, in part of these letters, an unease with Germany being part of this new world. But as I say, we're part of this new world already for more than 2 decades.
Okay. Klaus, in hindsight, do you think Germany was naive about what Russia would do? And was there perhaps a mistaken effort to kind of appease Putin in the lead up to this invasion?
Well, I always say we must go back a few decades when Olaf Scholz himself, part of my generation, was very active in the pan-European youth movements. Now, it was the antithesis to completely looking to the West, the transatlantic bridge, in particular in the Social Democratic Party. It was trying to work with the West and with the East, but make sure that there will never be any war again originating from European soil. Hence, friendly, positive relations with Moscow were absolutely the order of the day. But over the years, what people did not understand, I think, and now Olaf Scholz has come to this very, very dire conclusion that trust is one thing, but ultimately you cannot change power-hungry people from exercising their ill-fated desires. Now, Gerhard Schroeder is one example of the same generation, almost like Olaf Scholz, who simply said, East-West cooperation has stabilized Europe, has made sure there will never be any war, and we want to continue with it whilst being a member of NATO and fully included into the Western Bloc. Now, I think the realization came when public opinion polls and many members of the Social Democratic Party themselves said, Putin has gone too far. This is atrocity. This is a war. Innocent people are killed every day and we must stop it. Now, then the Green Party said, let's do something more proactive. Then the Social Democratic Party did some soul searching and said, shall we send heavy weaponry or not? Then the Bundestag, the parliament, came together with an overwhelming majority. But believe me, deep down in their hearts, most Social Democrats, perhaps even some of the Green Party members, would still say, can a war really be ended by sending weapons? And what would happen if Germany or NATO would now become a party to that war? This was the key argument Scholz always said. We must avoid becoming a party to the war. But this is impossible. Either you say you want to end Ukraine or you sit idle. But believe me, for Germans and definitely my generation, it is an absolutely complicated, difficult decision.
I have to ask you quickly, Klaus, because you brought up Gerhard Schroeder there. I mean, a huge Putin ally, basically on the Kremlin payroll as a lobbyist and, for his roles with Nord Stream and Russian gas companies. He's now being investigated for potential complicity in crimes against humanity because of his employment with those Russian state firms. He's also being looked at to receive the bad end of the sanctions on Russian money holders, basically, because he is on Kremlin payroll lists. What do you think is going to happen there? And what kind of example does it set?
Well, in very brief answer, today a poll was published, 63% of the German population are actually in favor of that Gerhard Schroeder should no longer be a member of the Social Democratic Party. I think, honestly, this would be one step too far. Go back years, go back decades, even in the Conservative Party. East-West community, East-West cooperation was literally the order of the day, not to overlook that the EU could expand eastwards, that NATO could expand one day. So I think singling out Gerhard Schroeder now for looking east would be the same as perhaps in Austria singling out former Chancellor Sebastian Kurz being on the payroll, supposedly I must underline, of an North American investment firm. Yes, of course, you can't compare the invasion of and by Russia into Ukraine with democracy in North America. But I think sometimes at the end of their active period, politicians go into private business. Some do the right, some do the wrong decisions. But honestly, it was a majority viewpoint in Germany to have good relations with Moscow.
Right.
And Gerhard, the only one.
Ulrich, I want to get your take on that. I mean, is it just unfair to punish Gerhard Schroeder for something that in hindsight was pretty logical?
Well, I think we paid too much attention to this one case. He's an old, stubborn man, and he ruins the reputation of what he has managed to achieve for this country. And if he does make the mistakes he's currently making, this doesn't change the bigger picture. We have so many important problems to discuss So what Schroeder says or what he thinks or how much wine he drinks is not my business.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you then about the fact that Germany has finally raised, defense spending to 2% of GDP. It was a NATO requirement, actually, that Germany always kind of managed to avoid. What do you think this means now for NATO, for the alliance?
Well, first of all, if we would think it would have been possible for Scholz to announce this during the election campaign, Scholz would definitely not be the chancellor that he is at the moment. No one could have won the elections announcing that I think there is a risk coming from Russia and therefore we have to expand our budget to the self-binding commitment of 2%, not to speak of the 100 billion of additional modernizing the German Bundeswehr. This is only possible in a Western-type democratic system in which you do not only have to communicate, but you also have to win majorities in the public and in the parliament. And therefore, it is only possible after the 24th of February. For NATO, it means that NATO is in a much better position than ever since the fall of the Iron Curtain, because NATO was in a serious identity crisis. And what Putin certainly didn't want to achieve was that NATO has a mission, that NATO is united, and NATO even has 2 more candidates knocking at the door, because even after hundreds of years of being neutral, Sweden now does not see any alternative but joining a defense alliance. And that speaks for itself.
Right. I mean, Bodo, a more powerful NATO is obviously seen by Russia as an even bigger threat. So NATO is obviously happy to see, members or potential members like Sweden and Finland, as interested as they are, and to see Germany, of course, boost its budget. But do you think is it good for dynamics between Russia and Europe that are obviously desperately strained already?
Oh, well, I mean, we see, and that was part of the focus of the whole debate, a very confusing, inconsistent debate. And as Ulrich has said, proving that the Chancellor is a very bad communicator over heavy weapons provision by Germany to Ukraine is the question of, how rational Putin is and how big for that reason, how much you can calculate and really foresee that actions by NATO, shipment of arms, heavy weapons by the West, inherits the danger of really slipping into a direct conflict between NATO member states and Russia. But I mean, it shows that this has breathed new life into NATO in a way unimaginable for NATO as a whole. Just take France, of which there's very little attention on these days. In a way, Germany has put itself into a crazy position of being the focus of all critique of this current conflict. While in a way this conflict comes at the end of a self-weakening and a retreat from the liberal world order by the West as a whole. It comes after 15 years, of a process of retreat of the U.S., which is not talking about here at all. We're not even talking about what will happen in this conflict. If Trump wins again in 2 years. There's no debate, about it. We have 10 years of crisis, existential crisis of the EU, of an internal democracy crisis of the EU, and subsequently its role in the national community. We see it these days with these oil sanction discussions and the trouble that Hungary is making. So in a way, the question of how rational Mr. Putin is acting here and how much counterproductive. It was primarily counterproductive, whatever he was intending to do with Ukraine. It has really, emboldened NATO and revived NATO and put Germany on a position where it was under pressure heavily by the Trump administration, if you recall, to come to this 2% aim. Which would have been unimaginable probably and would not have happened for a long time, except particularly, Ulrich has mentioned it, after an election campaign that has been void of any debate, even of the talk of the future of the EU, let alone foreign and security policy, played zero role in this campaign. And we now and again see it for what we have seen for a decade and a half with Ms. Chancellor Merkel, that we had election campaigns where the core issues that became the core political issues after the election campaign, EU policy and national policy, have played absolutely no role, and the legitimacy of a government has been built on domestic issues that has nothing to do with the core issues we're now dealing with.
Right. I mean, this sounds trivial to say it this way, but it really snuck up on so many of us, to be honest. Nobody,
Absolutely.
even up until the last minute, nobody thought these were issues we would really have to look at. And you could still say that we still heard people arguing that NATO wasn't really a necessary organization. And now, yes, it has seen this revival because of the conditions, but those conditions are really tragic for the world and especially, for Europe in this context. But let me go back, Klaus, to look at this change in policy and perhaps the consequences of the failure to change it sooner. Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba, he went as far as to say that Germany's position before was actually encouraging an attack on Ukraine by undermining unity. So seeing what's happened now, do you think that delay in taking these steps actually did embolden Russia to invade Ukraine?
No, I would not think so. Coming back to my esteemed colleagues, this world, to copy a famous quote, is bigger than Gerhard Schroeder and perhaps Mr. Gabriel and other close confidants formerly or cooperators with Vladimir Putin. No, I don't think so that Germany is in any way to blame for its reluctance not having stepped in sooner, because let us not forget one thing. Escalation is one side of the coin. To further escalate it is the other side of the coin. And the only thing which should not happen is that this catastrophe is spreading further. Now, when you send more weapons into one region and you send even more weapons, yes, of course, they will be used to defend a sovereign territory, but you must always be prepared to think about what will happen afterwards. And if I may have the last half minute, we always must remember that ultimately it should be the Ukrainian people who decide where they are actually headed. Do they want to be a full NATO member, a full EU member? Let us not forget, Turkey is in the waiting room for decades. If Brussels now promises Ukraine you will be a member within the next 24 months, sorry to be so frank, it is an outright lie, technically, legally, absolutely impossible. Secondly, would the Ukrainians really want it? Can there not be an independent, modern Ukrainian nation state devoid of any Russian influence when this heinous war has come to its end? I think this is what a number of Germans, or many Germans, would actually want to see. But honestly, I would not say that the hesitation Scholz said only a few days ago. Look at the United Kingdom. Look at Washington. Why did they not send any tanks previously to our decision in the Bundestag? And he is right. It was not only Germany refraining, probably for as long as possible, but then I would say the international Western community refrained too long.
Okay. Final question for Ulrich, then a much broader question. I mean, how far do you think Germany will go now to transform policy even further? How much more pragmatic might it be if this war continues and arguably gets worse in Ukraine?
Well, what we see at the moment is a communication strategy, not only by Scholz, but by all the other politicians, to prepare Germany that it's going to be expensive and it can last long. And so we shouldn't just believe that things will just go back to normal and that will be fine. But it will take as much as it is to stand united as a united West, and that prices will go up and there will be shortages in energy supply if things don't work out smoothly. So there's definitely more to come. But I think one can also trust in the ability of the German public to support the government and to understand the bigger picture and not to be too careful and sacrifice the reputation of Germany as a not so reliable partner.
Okay, Ulrich, you will have the final word. We are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.